Hi, I am Lauren from Lauren Watkins Art, and I am going to give you a tutorial on how to do this picture of a mother and baby. I have started off by drawing my design on a scrap piece of paper, and then I transferred it onto watercolor paper. I don't like drawing directly onto watercolor paper because it can damage the paper. I then took some masking fluid, which is kind of a rubber-based medium, and I put it over all the spots I wanted it to stay white. After that was dry, I then got the paper wet using a big brush and clean water, and after it was saturated, I started dropping in paint colors. Right now I'm dropping in some red violet, and before that I added some yellow green. I'm making sure to keep those paint colors kind of separate because if those two colors mix, it will turn a brown muddy color because they tend to be complementary colors. Now I'm adding some violet, and I'm just kind of figuring out where I want all the paint colors to go. I'm just taking my time and cleaning the paintbrush off in between each color so that I don't get too much mixing at this point in time. I want the mixing to happen on the paper. This will help keep the paints brighter and more fresh looking. So I added some ultramarine blue and now some more violet. And this paper is really saturated. At this point, I wanted the paper really saturated because it will allow the paint to flow as soon as it touches the paper. Now I'm adding some peacock blue, and it's kind of a green base, a more green base blue color. So phthalo blue would also work, or Prussian blue. This color looks really beautiful next to the yellow green I'm using. Now, as the colors get diluted onto that wet paper, I'm going to have to keep adding more and more layers of paint. Watercolor also is notorious for drying lighter than it appears, so it's also why I keep going back and adding more paint. It's because I really want to get some good saturated layers. It will also help in a technique that I will be showing you in just a few minutes. So there's some ultramarine blue. I really like the ultramarine for this piece because it's a granulating color, and so when it dries it gets a really beautiful texture. And with this piece, since it's kind of a two-dimensional painting, it's not really going for realism, and it doesn't have a lot of depth. Adding texture is a really great way to add interest to this piece. So I'm just kind of working around this area. That is the placenta area of the painting, and so I'm just kind of making sure the colors on that stand out against everything else. So I'm darkening it up. I'm just continuing adding more color and detail. This stage in the painting, you typically work pretty fast because you want to utilize the wetness of the paper. Later on you can add glazes, but to really get this blooming soft effect, you really want to utilize the paper right when it's wet and all the paint is wet, because then you'll start getting, the color will start mixing on the paper and make it look really beautiful. Now, the paints I am using are Mission Gold paints. They're from the 36-piece set. That's pretty easy to find on Amazon. I'll link it in the comments below. Now you can see I'm adding salt, and the salt will cause it to bloom, and I'm adding it into the more empty areas of the painting, and it will cause some white spots, and beautiful bursts of white will begin to show up. I let that air dry a little bit, and now I'm just kind of adding some paint to the area that the salt wasn't at. Now I'm drying the paint a little bit. I'm still going to keep the paper damp, but it was just too wet to do what I was wanting to do on the painting. So I'm just drying it a little bit. I'm using 100% cotton paper, and so it holds a ton of moisture. Going back to the paints I was using are Mission Gold paints. They are very vibrant colors, and they work really well with the salt. They don't stain quite as much as some of my other paints, and so I really needed to use something that could lift and still be bright, vibrant, and so these paints worked really well for what I wanted to achieve. Now I'm just continually strengthening color, looking at areas that might be too light, or I want to add another color to it, and so I'm just going over and adding some more detail. Now the brushes I'm using today are Creative Mark Mimic Synthetic Swirl brushes, and they are 100% synthetic, and they are great brushes. They're inexpensive for a really nice watercolor brush, and they hold a nice point and a lot of water, and so I've just really enjoyed it. My favorite brush is the brush I used at the beginning. That's a size 30 round, and that is a really large brush, but it works great for doing just clear water washes when I want to get the paper wet, but I can also paint with it when I start laying in initial washes, or I'm working on a really big painting, because it has such a fine point, where a lot of mop brushes I don't like using because they don't have a nice point to them. So I'm just going in, adding more color. Painting really is just kind of going back in, adding something, stepping away, looking at it, seeing what needs to be changed. It's kind of this constant give and take process of analyzing what you're doing, seeing what how the paint's reacting to that, and then going on from there. So adding a little bit more salt where I want some more blooms. You can see where some of the blooms have formed, especially on the thigh areas and the lower back. And now I'm also adding, with a water droplet, some clean water. And this will force some blooms and back runs and create some more texture and interest. I'm just letting it sit for a little bit and letting the water do its work with the paint, and just kind of analyzing how it's interacting with each other. Sometimes with watercolor, you just have to step away and wait and see what happens, because you can't really control it once it gets onto the paper. And it's also one of the things that makes watercolor fun, because it can be such a spontaneous medium. Adding just a few more water droplets. Some spots weren't lifting quite as much as I wanted to. And then I'm just taking a clean rag and just kind of dabbing those up, picking up the extra pigment. I let that dry all the way, and now I'm going back and doing some more refining work. I realized that I accidentally had put masking fluid over one of the legs of the baby, which was fine. So I peeled that back up and painted the leg. And now I'm going to go deepen the colors of the baby's body and add some kind of shadowy areas. But I'm glad I let the paint sit, because then I could see how light areas had gotten, and I knew what I needed to strengthen. If you find you're getting frustrated with a painting, it's good to just kind of take a step away if possible, and then come back to it with fresh eyes, and you can see what needs to be fixed more objectively, and you can see what's working and what maybe not, what's not working. Sorry. I'm still trying to get used to this whole voiceover thing. Let's see, I'm just adding some more blues, kind of just glazing over with some ultramarine blue. And my head's in the way. Sorry about that. Just kind of brightening up some greens areas, because they can kind of get darkened by the blues when they mix. Just checking to see if something's wet or dry. I wanted it to be a little bit wet so that I wouldn't get harsh lines. Now I'm just glazing. Glazing in watercolor is when the paper's dry and you're adding thin tinted layers of paint over the top. So it's not super pigmented, because you want to see the layers underneath. You're just kind of changing the hue a bit and adding more depth to the design. So one of my favorite things about watercolor is that since it's a translucent medium, it's really easy to get glazes and interest in your piece. Glazes work best if you let the paper dry in between each layer, and that way the paint underneath doesn't get lifted back up. A soft paintbrush, like the Mimic brushes I'm using, also work really well because they don't scrub the paper too much. Now I'm just adding some more water droplets, but these ones weren't quite as effective since the paper had dried, and the paint didn't lift off quite as easily with just dropping water. Now I could have scrubbed that with a stiffer tack-on brush, but it wouldn't have given me the look I was looking for. So just after adding those layers, I'm going to let it dry for a little bit and kind of see what happens. And then I'm also just about ready to remove the masking fluid, and I want to make sure the paper is absolutely dry for that part, because the paper will rip if the masking fluid, if you're removing masking fluid on wet paper. So you can see I'm removing the masking fluid. Typically I use a rubber cement pickup when I remove masking fluid, but I couldn't find mine. One of my kids probably ran off with it. So I just took a clean rag. It's colorful because it's stained with paint, but it was a clean rag, and I just kind of rubbed it over the top, and it helped pick up all those little bits of the rubber, of the masking fluid. Now, I like doing that better than rubbing my finger over the top, because you have paint that settles on top of the masking fluid from your washes, and if you rub that, it can smear onto those beautiful white areas that you had tried so hard to preserve. So unless you can peel it all up without any rubbing motion, I would suggest using a clean rag or one of the rubber cement pickups, erasers. Now, after removing the masking fluid, I started going in and refining more details on the baby. Sometimes masking fluid can interrupt kind of the look of something. It might have the fluid might have come out too thick, or in an area you didn't quite want. And so I'm just going in and making the nose and the features on the face how I wanted them to be. I'm just using a small brush. I think I'm using a number 2 or a number 4 mimic brush as I'm doing this. It has a super fine point, so I can really get into those details and just refine those tight areas of the painting. Because I really don't want to interrupt the white that's no longer protected, because that's such a big part of the design of this painting, is to keep that white contrast. So I'm just going in and refining the edges of where the masking fluid might have been too bumpy, didn't come out as smooth, or I want the paint to be a little bit thicker. I made sure to keep the masking fluid that's on the very edges of the body that touch the big open areas of white. I left that on for now. That way I just had an extra layer of protection to keep that area white. I didn't want any paint to flow out and ruin all the work I've been doing. So just continually smoothing out, just taking my time, really just making sure everything is how I wanted. I'm making sure to rinse off my brush every time I change colors on this painting. That way I don't get too much mixing. This is going back. I don't want to have complementary colors, the red based purple and the green to mix, because they'll make it like a muddy brown color, and I really didn't want that. I wanted this painting to stay vibrant. So it's important when you want something to stay bright and vibrant to rinse off your brush in clean water. I usually have 2 jars of water, one for a dirty rinse, and then after I rinse off the initial pigment, I dip my paintbrush into a clear jar of water, and that way I can get the best results with the painting. I'm just kind of analyzing what areas need more contrast, what areas are blending into each other, and just really adding darks and maybe a different color to areas that I want to stand out more. I'm just refining the baby's head so it's nice and smooth. And then I'm just going to let it dry for a little bit. Now I'm coming back in with some Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay India ink in white. And I'm doing this, forgot to remove some masking fluid. I'm doing this because some areas I forgot to add masking fluid to, or some I accidentally painted over after I took the masking fluid off. And then sometimes, kind of talked about earlier, how sometimes the masking fluid can be rough or not as smooth as we wanted it. And so I'm just taking the semi-opaque paint and just refining and adding some detail It's archival, and so it will last just as long as the watercolor. And then just strengthening up some of the whites. I'll be going back over some of the areas to just really help it become opaque. I like doing thin layers. If you do it too thick, it can crack and it won't look as nice on your finished piece. Now just adding some dark red violet to the umbilical cord and to the organs, just to really make it shine. I'm just gonna let it dry a little bit before I add some more layers. Now when I am adding glazes, I make sure to, if I don't want a harsh line, I'll do a stroke of the pigment I want, and then I will dip my brush in the clean water and touch the very edge of that paint that I just added with a wet clean brush, and that will help the paint flow out into them. Flow out, and it won't develop harsh lines, because your watercolor will go wherever it's wet. And so by adding that little bit of clean paint to it, it will just flow on out and soften the lines. So it will help all the glazes kind of blend into each other, and you'll get a nice smooth effect. So just adding some more white paint. I'm using a Royal Langnickel paintbrush. It's a Taklon brush, and I like to use that for the inks. I try to avoid using my watercolor brushes for acrylic-based inks because it can be really harsh on them. If you take care of your watercolor brushes and you use them for just watercolor, they can last you for your lifetime. Now I'm just removing the masking fluid that was on the very edges, kind of protecting the sides of the painting, and now I'm just going to refine. I'm taking some of that white ink and just going over maybe some places where a little tiny bit of the watercolor went over the edge of the masking fluid. They're very small spots, so I don't need very much. And I'm just kind of refining the back and just making it smooth. And then I had to turn the paper so I could have better brush control. It's okay to turn your picture in the direction you need it so you can have better brush control, and so you're not reaching over super wet spots. Just darkening the edges. I'm trying to make sure it's really dark on the edges that line the white. This will help give more contrast. I'm just smoothing a spot where the masking fluid had kind of misshapen the belly area. And just letting that dry for a minute before I come back and add more layers. Now, I didn't really like how the ear was looking on the baby, and so I'm just kind of going over with some paint, darkening that up, and then I'm going to add, once that dries, I'm going to add some white Indian ink and do the details again. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm just refining a spot. Oh, and got too much ink. I'm just refining a spot that some green paint had kind of bled out too far on, and so I'm just adding some ink to kind of mask that area. And then I'm drying it with my heat gun. Lots of times I use my heat gun to help dry in layers and make it quicker. With this piece, since I wanted the watercolor to really flow, I didn't use my heat gun as much as I normally do. Now that everything is completely dry, I'm taking just a white rubber eraser, and I am just going over and getting rid of any pencil lines that might not have been covered up by paint, and just really helping that clean up. Then just some final, just refining, getting everything exactly how I want it. Going in and fixing the ear now that that's dry. Kind of making the points of the white a little smoother. Letting it dry before I start the last few details. This is a commissioned piece, and the person that commissioned it wanted some personalized details added to the painting, and so now I'm just going in with ink and adding those in to the areas they want, and then it will be pretty much done. I'm just refining it. This is going to be a gift for her OBGYN as a thank you for delivering their baby, and it was such a fun project to work on and design. Now I'm just signing it, but it happens to be out of frame, and I apologize for that. But we are pretty much done. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe